step up and has to take on
security guarantees should come before any agreement.
Механизмом принятия решений по использованию военных
Europe has
сил.
been vilified as an age-slow, fragmented, constrained Zeitenwende.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-à-vis Europe is not Russia, is the threat from within.
Zerreißt Europa, zerreißt Deutschland.
The Art of Diplomacy. The official podcast of the Munich Security Conference.
Welcome to episode 6 of our podcast, The Art of Diplomacy, that I'm hosting together with my colleague, Josh Yaffa, who joins me for this introduction for the Munich Security Conference. Josh, before we talk about diplomacy, Germany and Ukraine, I think we should start with the most important fact about your guest on today's episode. Wolfgang Schmidt arrived at your conversation just a few hours after winning the Munich Security Conference Table Football Championship.
That's exactly right, Florence. Yeah, and I should say he was very proud of it. His victory came in the early hours of the morning before we spoke. He came physically and emotionally spent, but very up for our conversation, which lasted quite a long time. But we had a first chat about his victory in this indeed prestigious tournament that happens every year on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference. Apparently, his trophy, which he has won before, he's a multi-time winner of this contest, occupied a prime place at his office in the Chancellor. He even spoke before we started recording about how this trophy sat on a shelf that was visible in all of his calls whenever he was speaking with other government officials, ministers. A real power flex, I guess, when people see over your shoulder the MSC Table Football Championship trophy. So he's clearly proud of his prowess in the game. He has a demonstrated passion for table football that seems to animate him as much as conversations about war, peace, diplomacy, and all the rest.
You know, I was there. I also played. I didn't make it even to round 2 because I really am not good at this, but I enjoyed it.
I was going to say, in all of our calls, Florence, I haven't quite seen the table football trophy looming over your shoulder, intimidating me as we speak in the calls.
If you want to lose, play with me. Yeah, I'm going to make sure that you don't make it to anywhere near this trophy. But it's a very interesting experience. People do take it very seriously, and you get to know people on a personal level. We also talked with Benedict Franke about this in a different episode. But I do think that there is some analogy with diplomacy, table football, endurance, competitiveness, strategy under pressure, keeping you cool under pressure, and so forth. So it's a good place.
And also noticing perhaps when your opponent isn't paying attention, has been distracted for a moment, doesn't have his hand on the, knob, lever. I'm not sure the technical term. All the table football fans can write into the podcast to correct my appalling lack of knowledge of the lexicon of the game. But when your opponent isn't quite engaged or paying attention, you can, of course, use those opportunities to push your own advantage.
Josh, do you want to be on my team next year?
Well, you had quite the advertisement for the path to victory that entails, but sure, I accept. Let's try. Let's be the underdogs.
So, joking aside, though, your guest was Wolfgang Schmidt. Wolfgang Schmidt was for 4 years at the center of German power from 2021 to 25. He was the head of the German Chancellery and also the chief coordinator of the intelligence services. So he wasn't just observing decisions, he was helping actually to make them.
That's exactly right. He was really at the center of power for a stretch of really key years in terms of geopolitics and German foreign policy. He was one of Olaf Scholz's closest advisors throughout the first year of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a key moment in European security and German foreign policy and security policy. And if you want to understand how Germany made decisions during that period, not only the debate that played out in public, but internal deliberations, then he's really one of the key people who can tell that story.
And of course, this was an important time for Europe, time for NATO, but for Germany in particular, because Germany, as you said, is when it's an important European power. It's set at the center of supporting Ukraine, but also avoiding war with Russia. And at the same time, I would think also struggling with its own strategic culture that was, well, actually is still being born. So he was at the center of that.
Exactly. And this moment of struggle with strategic culture was encapsulated in Scholz's immediately famous and oft-quoted Zeitenwende speech. Wolfgang Schmidt was at the center of preparing that speech and the foreign policy thinking that went into it, which really set in motion a new course, a new way of thinking for German security policy, and contained a number of dilemmas about how it should be implemented. And one version holds that Germany, in fact, moved too slowly and was too hesitant to implement this new course, to fully embrace it. Another version holds or kind of offers that Germany was trying to manage enormous risks that are easy to forget now, easy kind of to judge from the sidelines. And Wolfgang Schmidt was very much not on the sidelines. He was really in the arena, both in terms of global security policy and table football, and he was able to bring us inside how that diplomatic balancing act works in practice.
There's a moment in your conversation where you asked him about two competing interpretations of Western policy in this regard. Tell me a bit about that.
Right. Of course, it's a bit of an oversimplification, but I still think a helpful paradigm to consider. One is the so-called boiling the frog theory of the case. Popular in some quarters in Washington, people in the Biden administration were proud of having pulled this off, which is effectively to increase support for Ukraine gradually, step by step, so that they never provide Russia or Putin with a particular acute moment when Russia felt like it had to escalate dramatically. So just like you boil the frog, you turn up the degree, the pressure, what you're doing, and the arms you're providing specifically for Ukraine step by step so that Putin never feels like he has to do something dramatic in response. The other end of this paradigm, or the kind of its diametric opposite, is the so-called killing us softly theory of, in fact, what happened with Western support for Ukraine in those years. And this is something I heard in Kiev toward the end of 2024, toward the end of the Biden administration, as in the U.S., officials were preparing for the incoming Trump administration. And killing us softly effectively means that Western powers, the United States, Germany, others, gave Ukraine just enough military support in order to survive, to stave off total defeat, but never enough to actually decisively win, to keep Ukraine in the game, but essentially pave the way toward perhaps a slow defeat in what had become a war of attrition fairly quickly in 2022 and 23. And, which theory of the case is most accurate, which one most fairly describes Western policy is a super important question for journalists, historians, analysts of military and security policy. And it's one I wanted to put to Wolfgang.
Mm-hmm. What surprised you the most in your conversation with him?
A couple things. One, how much German decision-making, Western decision-making, really writ large, in those years was shaped by uncertainty. First and foremost, uncertainty about how Putin and the Kremlin might react. That was and is a real black box for Western policymakers who have to make really high-stakes decisions about military and diplomatic policy without really understanding the decision matrix, red lines, and so on of their strategic adversary, in this case, Putin and Russia writ large. And the second is how much important diplomacy happened behind the scenes. There was a fascinating moment that I knew I wanted to ask Wolfgang about, and that is Chancellor Scholz's trip to Beijing in the fall of 2022, which had been planned for totally different reasons. It just so happened that it occurred at the time when Ukraine was making really unexpected and really rapid gains on the battlefield in a surprise counteroffensive that saw Russia lose a lot of territory that it had occupied in the early days of the war. And this was a really embarrassing moment for Putin, a promising one for Ukraine, but there was a fear that that might be the sort of thing that could trigger an escalation from Putin, perhaps even the use of tactical nuclear weapons. This is something that Western intelligence and security officials were picking up on. And it just so happened that Chancellor Scholz was in Beijing when all this was happening. Of course, Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, had and has a particularly close relationship with Putin. And so Scholz used the opportunity of being in Beijing to try and convince Xi to then in turn convince Putin not to use nuclear weapons. I knew the vague contours of that story, but having Wolfgang in the studio was a chance to dig into the particulars in much more detail.
I think that what's interesting about that is that people think diplomacy is the big historic agreement, the handshake, the photo, the big speech. But in reality, it's very often the grind of, diplomatic exchanges, endurance, navigating uncertainty, not knowing actually the exact results of your decisions, because none of the decisions are ideal.
Exactly, and that's what I most enjoyed in this conversation with Wolfgang is we had a really tactical level conversation about key events and getting into that messy decision-making process that you described. And Wolfgang repeatedly came back to this idea that in the real world, policymakers don't get to choose between a good option and a bad option. That would be too easy and quite obvious. Oftentimes they're choosing between two bad options and trying to figure out which one is less dangerous. And it was really fascinating and a great opportunity to talk to Wolfgang about how that looked and felt in practice.
So you did a real tour d'horizon from Germany's Zeitenwende to nuclear policy, from Ukraine to China, and from difficult compromises to impossible decisions in this podcast.
And so here's my conversation with the former head of the German Chancellery, Wolfgang Schmidt.
So,
good. Wolfgang, hi. Thanks for talking with us.
Good to be here.
I realize I'm catching you the morning after your illustrious victory in the MSC Tabletop Football Championship, so congratulations.
Thank you very much.
I realize that's quite a tradition around these parts.
It is. We invented that actually in 2019, and the first winner was ICANN, so the Nobel Peace Prize winners, and I was defeated in the final back then, won in 2020 and now 2026 again, so it's a good tradition.
Okay,
also
second time champion. I realize that I understand this trophy occupied pride of place in your office in Kanzleramt?
Absolutely, it was there on display. A bit of showing off in these things is not too bad, I would say.
Good, okay, well the trophy returns, congratulations.
But not to the Chancellery.
Your career, which is what I want to talk about in politics and diplomacy, it tracks in many ways with Germany's own emergence or re-emergence as a major player, a major power even, not just economically, but politically and diplomatically, militarily in Europe. And that was a role that, for all the historic reasons we know, was one that the rest of Europe and even Germany itself was uncomfortable with for some time. It didn't know how that shoe fit, if it wanted the shoe to fit. Tell us how your thinking evolved, Germany's, Chancellor Olaf Scholz. How did you kind of witness this shift in Germany's posture in Europe and in the world?
I think the term that Chancellor Scholz coined was Zeitenwende, so watershed moment or turning of times.
Talking a lot about that.
And that captures it. So there is a before and an after the Russian invasion. And we were a little bit this country that was leading from behind, the reluctant hegemon in Europe due to our history. And I think the Russian full invasion on the 24th of February 2022 made everybody realize that this is definitely over. And even those who had illusions about the possibility to partner up with Russia, to change them through economic ties or whatsoever, realized at that very moment that this didn't work. And so they joined those who were more skeptical from the beginning. And this term as well was meant to bring everybody into the camp and so that we could move forward from there. And if I may, I would add another element. This did not fall just out of the sky that we were that reluctant and that we didn't invest enough in defense. That was a deliberate political decision. And my argument is it was not only because the threat perception was wrong vis-a-vis Russia, but also we put a thing that you would only find in Germany, I guess, a constitutional debt break at the top priority. So a balanced budget was what we considered more important to spend enough into defense, security, and even infrastructure.
I want to talk
for just a minute longer about the before part of the Zeitenwende before we turn to the after. And you used an interesting word for me, reluctance, the reluctant power, the reluctant hegemon. And I wonder if you could walk me through that reluctance, how it manifests itself, perhaps in your own thinking, perhaps in the Chancellor's thinking. What did it kind of mean to be a statesman, a diplomat, a head of state, right? These are all occupations or positions we think of as being quite powerful, quite kind of proactive, right? So what did it mean in your own thinking, your own actions? Those are the Chancellors. Talk to us a bit about reluctance in practice.
Yeah, so maybe for starting off by saying both Olaf Scholz and myself, we are from Hamburg, the free and Hanseatic city of Hamburg, a city-state, a city republic. And there was another guy from Hamburg who was Chancellor, and that was Helmut Schmidt. And Helmut Schmidt always talked about Germany as a European middle power, a phrase that is now again very, very well in use. And the idea behind that was basically, we are not a superpower. We are not at the same level at the United States or Russia or China. And we are a European middle power. We are obviously the biggest power, the biggest economy, the most people in Europe, and we're at the center of Europe. And most of the conflicts during the past 200 years in Europe were basically about Germany's role. Should we partner more with Russia? Should we move to the West? And that was then decided after the Second World War and the reconstruction of Germany, that we clearly decided we should belong to the Western camp. And remember, Konrad Adenauer, the first German Chancellor, even kind of sacrificed German unity towards being integrated, deeply integrated in the West. And I think that was the right decision to do. But it was something that tells you something about Germany and its role in Europe. So that is that people were afraid in the past of Europe, were afraid of having a big army, of being so powerful that it would destabilize Europe. And the whole process of the European integration, the Franco-German interdependency that was created, all that was in this famous words of keeping the Germans down. That was the funding idea of also NATO.
And did you feel this yourself as you and in tandem with Olaf Scholz as you rose through party politics, German politics, eventually rising to the Chancellery? How did you feel that reluctance, even as you were kind of climbing to the commanding heights of politics? Did you understand it within yourself and the Chancellor as well?
I started my political career in the youth organization of the Social Democratic Party, and pretty soon ended up in the European youth organization, and then later on in what was called, and don't be shocked, the International Union of Socialist Youth. That was the youth organization of the Socialist International back in the day, headed by Antonio Guterres, the now Secretary General of the UN. And what I realized there, both in Europe with the Friends of the other party youth organizations and on the international scene, that all these discussions that we were having in Germany about our history and that we should be more cautious, nobody else was talking about. And what you then see now, and this famous phrase of Radek Sikorski, the now again foreign minister of Poland, that he'd fear Germans' reluctance more than German leadership, was broadly reflected. And so that in my upcoming really stayed. And so I always thought we should not pretend to be a superpower. We should be very clear that we are a middle power, but we should also understand that we are a power and that our actions have consequences. And maybe it was a fortunate coincidence that our term as Chancellor or head of the Chancellery started at the beginning of December 2021. And so just really in the ramp up of the confrontation and the beginning of the full invasion. So we kind of had a clean sheet when it came to the relation of the Chancellor with Putin. They didn't go back a while like Macron and Putin. They were not on first name base. And so it was more of a sober relationship and probably more realistic, therefore.
Right. So we've talked already a few times about Zeitenwende, this famous speech that the Chancellor gives, I believe, on the third day after the invasion.
Yeah, that's Sunday. It was the 27th, I think.
So it's an immediately famous speech, a historic speech that set in motion a policy, also known as Zeitenwende, this turning point. before we get to all that followed and how it was implemented actually as a course of action, tell us just a bit about the speech, how it came together. Give us a sense of who wrote it, how it was written, the kind of spirit of the time, that very kind of fraught and extremely grave first few days of the invasion.
Yeah. So, I mean, we all know the invasion was on that Thursday. And so immediately then, back in the day, Germany had the presidency of the G7. So we were very active in like policy making, having a G7 that was also the times of COVID, G7 video conference, informing the German public and so on and so forth. And then the head speechwriter, and every politician or chancellor or prime minister has such an office of speechwriters, started to discuss with the chancellor what he would like to have in that speech. And he started drafting that and going back and forth with the chancellor on Friday. And then myself, as the head of the chancellery, the chief of staff, the governmental spokesperson, obviously the foreign and security advisor, but also his economic advisor, we were gathering and looking at the first draft, and that was more of an outline. And then you also realize that there is parts of a speech that is still policy in development. So, for example, part of the speech and the policy shift that followed that was a proposal of a 100 billion package of new debt, changing the constitution for the armed forces. And that was something that still needed to be agreed upon between the finance ministry and the finance minister and the coalition partner and the other coalition partner, the Green Party. So you were kind of writing stuff at the same time where you were negotiating stuff.
And the headline phrase, Zeitenwende, did that come first when you understood the kind of gravity of the moment, and then you kind of backfilled all of the proposals that would bring that idea to life? Or rather, as you were coming up with specific proposals, understanding all these policy shifts that would have to happen, at the end you realized, oh, this is so significant, we need to give it this headline title?
It was from the very beginning in the draft, and I have this different versions in Word with track change mode. So I was like following, and also the additions that I did. It wasn't there, but a bit hidden in the middle of the document, and then we discussed, and then as you go back and forth, then it was more a statement. Das ist eine Zeitenwende. This is a watershed moment. And what I found interesting, it's always perceived as a policy program. And in reality, it was only, or foremost, the description of what was happening. And then after that came the consequences of this watershed moment or turning point in history. And that was the elements that we focused more about. So back in the day, if I remember correctly, it was not that it was the headline, no, the Zeitenwende speech, but as very often with speeches, people even perceive it differently than you write it, and then they pick some line, some sentence, or even one word out of it and make it then the name of the speech.
Sure. And that word, of course, became a meme in and of itself and came to define not just that speech, but the years of German policy that followed under Scholz. And there was this idea that, given the very name itself, historic turning point, that Germany had undergone a kind of phase transition, right? There was a sort of before and after. But actually, what followed was a prolonged debate, continued soul searching, a kind of one step forward, two step back approach, specifically here to arming Ukraine. How involved would Germany be in that fight? What kinds of weapons would it provide Ukraine to aid in its defense? And so on. There were all of these on talk shows in Bundestag, everywhere you can imagine, about what kind of weapons can be sent, what would provoke a reaction from Russia, what actually would be helpful, what would be counterproductive, and so on. So tell me about how you and the Chancellor kind of navigated all of those different tensions, domestic ones, and also, and perhaps in a way most interestingly, trying to gauge and kind of stay ahead of the Russian reaction, giving enough to help Ukraine in its fight, but not enough that would provoke an escalatory reaction from Putin. You had all these pressures that made Zeitenwende maybe less kind of clean than many expected or hoped in those first days as it played out over years.
Yeah, but once again, Zeitenwende was really meant as the pure description of what was happening, and the actions that followed Zeitenwende we never coined as Zeitenwende. And maybe that was part of the problem in the perception. And I would add to your list of pressures one that had a direct impact on Germany, and that was our energy dependency from Russia. So back then we had nearly 60% of our gas coming from Russia, 50% of coal, 35% of oil. And unfortunately, Germany had forgotten to, for example, build terminals for liquefied natural gas. So we were pretty dependent on Russia, and cutting off Russian gas would have had a disastrous consequence for the German economy. And so that was, besides like arming Ukraine, keeping the alliance together, keeping Europe together with sanction packages and so on, coordinating with partners, that was something that was very much on our mind as well.
In other words, just to be, so I understand the point correctly, in other words, we can't give Leopard tanks right away because we still have this energy dependence?
Not at all. I hope I did not never say that, because that was never on our mind. No, the problem was more... in order to be able to support Ukraine financially and militarily, you have to have a strong home base. So if your industry collapses and if your tax revenues collapse, if you have a constitutional debt brake in place that limits your spending, then you're screwed. Then you cannot deliver what is needed. And the second element is also the support of the broad public. And we already saw that in Germany happening, in the eastern parts of Germany. There was very much the discussion, why do you have money for Ukraine? Why do you have money for arms? And why didn't you have money for us, for the infrastructure, for whatever? And so it was like keeping Germany united and the German population behind the support for Ukraine. And just a fun fact, because I looked that up the other day, there was 2 polls at the beginning of February 2022. So a 2 weeks into the invasion. And German people were asked, would you support weapon deliveries to Ukraine? And in one poll, 71, and the other poll, 75% of the people said no, even though it was not widely reported what was going on. And it was only a question of time that Russia was fully invade Ukraine. The majority, 2/3 of the, or even more, 3/4 of the German people said no, we should not export arms, deliver arms, donate arms and equipment and kit to Ukraine. And that goes back to your previous question. It's a long German history. There was a broad consensus about among political parties not to deliver weapons into zones of conflict, let alone war. And that shows you maybe also, coming to your question now, the dramatic shift that we implemented by deciding on Saturday, and I presided in a telephone conference over the National Security Council that has to approve weapon deliveries, that we said, okay, now we do that and we go in full Monty. And this full Monty discussion you mentioned in talk shows about every weaponry system, I think that was very unique for Germany. No?
I don't remember any other country that could have so many hours of political talk shows talking about tank deliveries.
Exactly. And like I was also back in the day the coordinator for the intelligence services. And I was very unhappy because in the Second World War, there was this poster saying, loose lips sink ships. And the idea that you display everything to the Russians, what you were delivering, when, was very unsettling. And like I would say that it is a little bit an expression of, I called it in a moment, the teenager years of Germany. So we are growing up into a nation that also uses hard power, or at least delivers hard power to an ally. And meanwhile, other nations have a stronger history with that, or better history, because they were on the right side of history, not as Germany on the wrong side of history with the First and the Second World War. That coming to this adult life, we all know hormones shoot and you're uncertain of yourself. And so to stay in that metaphor, I think that's what we witnessed. So every talk show was discussing the pros and cons of weaponry systems. And the reality on the ground was we did not have huge storage capacities full of tanks ready to deploy, or howitzers, or even Taurus kind of cruise missiles. But we had depleted, we had gone from over 1,000 tanks to a few hundred, less than 500 tanks. And so it was like the discussions we had with the leadership of the military, with the different branches, was very often, if we deliver that to Ukraine, what does that do to our soldiers? And so it was not so much the escalatory thing, that was another element, but it was very often also the question on ammunition, for example, on the Panzerhaubitze 2000, that was the first heavy equipment that we delivered out of our own stocks, that the army leadership very often said, this is really stretching what we have.
And how do you think, it sounds like, one of the more important kind of breaks, or at least factors in moving this policy forward was German public opinion, German mindset, this historic mindset, a kind of reluctance across the nation that you had to...
But that had completely changed. That was what I'm saying. So that was like, for me, walking from the Chancellery, that's like a few hundred meters to go to Parliament. No, and we met the morning of the 27th when he delivered his speech in Parliament. Later, I think at 11 o'clock or so, we met in the Chancellery, and then we went there. It was a winter, chilly day, but very sunny. And on the way to the Chancellery, you saw hundreds, if not thousands, of people wearing Ukrainian flags, rallying in the city, in the capital, but not only in Berlin, but in Hamburg, in Munich, in Frankfurt, in even the smallest cities in Germany, people were going out and demonstrating support for Ukraine. So the 71% that a few weeks earlier had opposed weapon delivery, I felt would be with us in that policy shift that Scholz was about to announce.
Yet the debate that came, I guess, a year later, for example, about Leopard tanks, felt very pained. It didn't feel like there was national consensus about that point.
That's true, and it's especially interesting that there was a clear difference between West Germany and East Germany. So every poll about weapon delivery, and you could really see the yes vote and share in West Germany was the no share in East Germany, and vice versa. And again, that was a little bit our job as well, to keep the country together. Because what we see now in the US, but we see it in other places as well, if you lose the support of the people for what you're doing, then you're pretty much limited. Just let me add one thing, and that I always found a bit bothering about the debate we had in the day. We were discussing so many about details, like, is the Leopard tank better than the T-72? Yes, it is. Should it be delivered? There's maybe kind of things that should be considered, like supply chains, ammunition, and so on. But in these debates about details, people forgot to mention that Germany very soon emerged as the number 2 supplier of financial and military aid to Ukraine, by far. And in Europe, we were by far number 1. And even people that were way more outspoken on what they would be doing. And I won't mention names, but for example, UK, had they done, compared to GDP now, what we did, they had to double the military support for Ukraine. So, to be honest, I found it sometimes a bit uninformed that people were discussing about certain systems and forgetting to mention that Germany was delivering heavily. And if you ask the Ukrainians, it was also, like, I would say, we probably under-promised, but we over-delivered.
I want to get to in a second, actually, the view from Ukraine. So there's 2 descriptive metaphors I've heard for not just German aid to Ukraine, Western aid more broadly, that I want to run by you. What I've heard from officials in the now former Biden administration is that they think they, quote, boiled the frog successfully. That is, by ramping up the military aid step by step, not giving F-16s on day one, but now there are F-16s flying over Ukrainian skies, that they essentially never gave Putin the pretext to do something dangerously escalatory. He had to sort of get used to it, one weapon system at a time. And they think that was quite successful. But I heard in Ukraine at the end of the Biden presidency, so sort of fall of 24, that as one diplomatic source put it to me, it felt like the Biden administration or the West more broadly had engaged in a, quote, killing us softly program, which was giving this kind of drip, drip flow of aid that always managed to keep Ukraine from outright defeat, but never really gave it a good shot at outright victory either. So in hindsight, kind of between those two poles, those two strategies, the boil the frog, killing us softly, who in hindsight was right? And do you wish that you and Germany had erred more in one direction or the other?
I think the verdict is still out. Because we don't know whether this war will come to an end and whether Putin hopefully will understand what he's doing and stop it, because he's the only one that can stop it. I think the question is very difficult to answer because there's no formula. There's no rule book that says if we do A, Putin does B. And so that is the on one side, strategic ambiguity that I always thought we needed. So to leave Putin, to make it more difficult for Putin to predict what would happen.
Calling back on your experience atop the German intelligence community, can you just give us any insight into scenario planning? I understand that it's an art, not a science, right? But trying to understand, even with all of the caveats and imprecision that would be involved in this exercise, trying to understand if we do this, Putin does that. Like, how does that actually look? Can you give us any insight into that process?
You have to understand Putin is a guy that is very much looking, and we saw that in the ramp-up of the full invasion, very much looking to be seen as acting on a legal base. He always wanted to be able to explain what he's doing to the outside in a rational way, and that he was like working according to law. Complete BS, but that's how he operates. How do you know how he operates? Obviously, you have an intelligence community and in the US headed by then Bill Burns, the incredible director of the CIA, who was a very senior diplomat, posted in Russia, speaking Russian, having met Putin several times. So the real problem in assessing what Russia would do is that it was not Russia, it was Putin. It was all in Putin's mind. And what people also realized that during the COVID times, he had kind of isolated himself more. There were not so many voices out there that would compete and have an open discussion. No, we all see people falling out of windows in Moscow nowadays if they dissent to the president. And Bill Burns coined that phrase that stuck with me by saying it's not a career-enhancing moment to tell the president the truth.
So when you are trying to gauge this kind of escalation ladder on the Russian side, and there's all this ambiguity involved, did you find that you and others, you sort of err on the side of, well, let's not kind of push too far and find out our analysis was wrong in kind of underestimating Russia's willingness to escalate, or the opposite, since we don't know, we can kind of push a bit farther because the line is a bit fuzzy, and let's see how far we can take our own policy? How did that actually play out in practice?
The thing is that in office, looks a bit different than from the chair of a think tanker.
Or podcast studio.
Or journalist, because you have to deal with the real consequence. And like my idea was always, either we would end up as a footnote in the book of world's history as being the ones that betrayed Ukraine and didn't do enough so that they were occupied, or, and probably then this book wouldn't exist any longer, that started World War III. And so in between these two poles, you had to find the right course. And I think it is the right thing to go step by step and not like in a podcast studio say, oh, let's try this. And if it fails, oh yeah, okay, sorry. You can't restart the game. And the problem is like dealing with a nuclear superpower, and where you unfortunately have an actor that is more willing to make use of nukes than probably a democracy would be, where you have checks and powers, where you have a free media that would question his judgment. It's very difficult to foresee that you can actually win militarily. And I think what everybody saw was that freeing Crimea, which would be desirable and regarding international law, the right things to do from Russian occupation, would probably had probably been the point where Putin would have said, that's something that I cannot sell to the Russians.
Two questions about this fear of kind of what
it was. I'm a bit careful and sensitive in framing it fear. I think this is like a scenario consideration.
Let's call it, if you're comfortable with that term.
But because fear is an emotion.
Is it?
And obviously, when you do these political calculations, you understand there is a thing from the good old days of nuclear deterrence. We all know that is nuclear signaling, and we are fully aware of that. And so if you look at options and you look at public statements by Medvedev back in the day and so on forth, you deduct that. You know that he's playing with like uncertainty in the government and fear in the population. So we never fueled that. And that was why I was a little bit angry in these days when people from the outside, journalists or others, were alluding to, Scholz was kind of threatened by the use of nuclear force. No, it was never happening. That Putin never ever in any conversations with the German government, at least, mentioned the term nukes or nuclear bombs or the usage of it. But nevertheless, these reports were out.
Sure, though it's a bit kind of like a Chekhov play. I mean, the gun is on the wall.
Exactly.
You don't necessarily need to talk about it for others to notice.
Yeah, but remember when Scholz then went at the beginning of November to China to make sure.
I want to actually talk about that trip in great detail. Yeah. That's a key moment of German diplomacy that perhaps played a historical role that's actually under kind of covered, and I want to unpack it with you. But before we get to Beijing, chronologically, it happened just a couple months before, sort of September 2022. This is at the height of this first Ukrainian counteroffensive, really the only successful Ukrainian counteroffensive of the war, where there were all these reports at the time and certainly later that Western leaders, the Biden administration certainly feared that if the Ukrainian counteroffensive was even more successful than it had been, say began to threaten Russian control over Crimea, that this could be the thing that triggered potential escalation all the way to nuclear escalation. You talked about that a minute ago. Can you just sort of ground your general analysis in the feeling and the conclusions and maybe concerns, if that's a fair word, of the time? Sort of how real did that threat feel? And is it also true, as some reporting has emerged, that there were some signals sent from Washington, maybe from Berlin, other European capitals, to Kiev, like, don't actually push this too far right now because we think it could pardon the sort of terrible pun, blow up on you and all of us.
Yeah. So from Germany, there was never ever, I mean, at least from official channels and from what we were responsible for, and I'm not aware of anything else, any of these signals or messages, because I would have to say that would have been inappropriate. Other supporters of Ukraine were more involved, I would say, in military strategy. And it has emerged as well that there was some frustration with some of the allies about the way that political leadership in Ukraine was going against military wisdom and what, for example, back in the day, Zaluzhny as the commanding general was proposing. That was not always what the political sphere would want, and vice versa. And so there was also some frustration, not even going back at the beginning of the war. I remember the Munich Security Conference 4 years ago, just a few days before the full invasion started, that President Zelensky was on stage, but also in background on the bilateral meeting saying, no, this won't happen. And I remember the Americans being very frustrated of having told the Ukrainians for 5 months, this is going to happen. They gonna invade. Prepare. Move troops to Kiev to protect Kiev. And the Ukrainian side didn't respond to that. So I would say it's a more complex thing. And I'm, as I said, not aware of this kind of threats or nudging and towards the Ukrainians.
That September, roughly speaking, September 2022 was this moment of acute concern over possible Russian escalation all the way to nuclear. Did you have intelligence on that? Did you have, was that your own analytical conclusion,
No.
Kanzleramt? Can you kind of tell us about what that period felt like in Western capitals and how real this danger felt?
It's a bit like my problem now is, well, A, there's some stuff that is still classified, and B, like if you look back, and there were so many events at the same time happening, it's very difficult, because I was not like sitting down and writing every evening a diary, and now I have a list here. I could tell you, okay, on this day that happened. But like in retrospective, it becomes a bit blurry. When did actually happen what? So probably I should sit down one day and write it down for myself and then fact check, because the memory sometimes plays funny games with you. So as I recall it, and then the problem is that there's reporting afterwards, and that then gets mixed with the actual memory that you have. So the reporting afterwards, what we see now is that there were these kind of discussions between the Americans and the Russians. I recall what we call there's this vertical escalation. So like the question, would they dare to use tactical nukes? And then also the question, would they just make a test, so to send a signal to especially Western population or even Ukrainian population? Would they deploy it at the front line, a very small nuke? Would they do it in the hinterland of Ukraine? So there's different scales. But then there's something called the horizontal escalation. And that is, I think, a little bit underreported, because we had other scenarios like the Houthis in Yemen. Now, had the Russians delivered modern anti-ship missiles, that would have had an impact on world economy because of oil supplies, and would have shifted the balance in another theater in the Middle East. So things are related. And when you said like Crimea was at risk, I don't recall it like that. I was saying...
No, I was really just playing off of what you had said, felt like in your own analysis or kind of across the political intelligence community in Germany would be something that for Putin would begin to feel kind of existential.
I always found when people were saying like Russia must lose, Ukraine must win, my second question was, okay, what does it actually mean? And if people then would say, okay, yeah, obviously the full liberation of every occupied square of Ukrainian soil, which is the right thing, but including Crimea, the question is that a feasible option? And I think if you try to do a scale, then on one side of, like on the extreme side of the scale would be freeing every square kilometer of Ukraine territory, including Crimea. And there's where I say I don't think that this is a realistic assumption, because like for 99% probably of the Russian population, Crimea belongs to Russia. There they agree with Putin. And I think Putin, as a dictator manipulating the media, can sell anything to the Russian people as a victory, but probably losing Crimea, not so much.
Tell us then a bit about some, what I imagine were tough conversations. If the Chancellor said what you just said to Zelensky, which I hope, in other words, if that was the kind of private opinion of yourself and in the Chancellery, that it must have been expressed in some form to the Ukrainians. I don't think it was kind of kept secret or private in Berlin. How was that message delivered to Zelensky?
And I think that is one of the problems, and maybe that is why what we are facing now with Trump being very explicit about certain things and using even probably coercion towards the Ukrainians is moving things. The West, including the Chancellor, myself, all other officials, they're very reluctant in doing that. No, you
think
remember
you were too polite, too sympathetic? You let your you supported heart and mind the Ukrainian cause, and that kept you maybe from sharing some hard truths. Is that fair?
No, I think because I personally then tried to discuss that in an open and candid way, but you need to have trust. And you need to have like the actions speaking before that. No, only when you prove to be a reliable supplier and supporter and delivering weapons and being really the number one source in Europe of military aid, then you could start with people that you know. So, for example, I did this with Kuleba, the then foreign minister. We established, I think, a very good personal relation where we could discuss these things very openly.
And so what was a hard truth that you delivered to him?
The hard truth was that I don't think that this is realistic, that you will free all of your territory in the first place. So I think we will see a situation where de facto Russia will occupy your territory or parts of your territory, hopefully a small part of your territory, and you will never ever accept it de jure and recognize that. But we've seen examples in Europe. No, we've seen the example Baltics. We've seen the German question. We never accepted the separation, and nevertheless, it was a fact.
Do you think that it was a mistake that Europe took too long to articulate that openly, publicly, to kind of make that official policy vis-a-vis Ukraine? I mean, that line, it's still fuzzy as to whether or not kind of European leaders want to embed this in sort of official policy towards Ukraine. But certainly in 2022-23, this was something that sort of no European leader openly was saying was the kind of likely endgame for this war. Do you think that was a mistake?
No, because that would have put pressure on the Ukrainians when they needed support. But that's why it is so delicate. No, it is, and especially in the moment. Now, in hindsight, you could say, because you know how things developed, and now it's like, yeah, sure, they should have done that like 3 years ago, and would have saved thousands of lives. Again, it is Putin who is not stopping, and he could have stopped back in the day. He could stop today. He could stop tomorrow, and he's not willing to. And so the huge question for everybody all the time, and again, there's no formula, was how to bring Putin to do that. So one of the theories we applied was, okay, he should suffer that much that he realizes if he continues that way, he would lose more than he would actually win. So that the calculus that he was doing would shift towards, okay, let's end this, let's freeze that. Didn't really work. And I still believe that we have a moral obligation, a political obligation to support Ukraine, because they are unlawfully attacked against all international law, against the UN Charter. And so then kind of shooting them in the back by publicly demanding they should give up territory, I think that is not our place. So the phrase the Chancellor always used was, Russia must not win, Ukraine must not lose, and it is the Ukrainian people and their democratically elected president that have to decide what they want to do, and we will support them. And what they can be assured of is that we will support them militarily, financially, as long as it takes.
Sure. As long as it takes, actually, was the phrase that my diplomatic source in Kiev turned into killing us softly. Sort of as long as it takes, it can also be sort of bleed the patient out interminably.
Yeah, but that was, to be very clear, never the intention. And But
was it the effect?
I don't think so. But I mean, no, it's counterfactual. We won't know. And again, the problem is, like, look at Patriots or look at Iris-T that is desperately needed for air defense and to shoot down rockets, cruise missile and drones. Unfortunately, we are not producing them at a scale that is needed. So every system, like Germany at the end donated 25% of its Patriot systems to Ukraine. Ukraine had Iris-T systems way before one system ended up in the arms of our army. And my perception is we have, I would say, probably 95% of alignment between Ukrainian interest and Western or NATO or what you ever call it interest. And there is this little thing that where we really have different interests as well. And I think it's important to talk about your interest as well. And my pledge in front of the German parliament was foremost to the German people and not to the Ukrainian people.
That gets to this question of escalation, which we talked about earlier, which is, as I heard in Ukraine all the time, is, from our perspective, how could things escalate further? We're already in a fight for
that's what I'm saying.
Existence
It's
of our country.
exactly a different perception and I completely understood that. So I was never angry even about the very outspoken...
Sure, I'm just trying to diagnose that 5%.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, from the Ukrainian perspective, having the most powerful military alliance fighting on your side with European soldiers, European aircrafts, European rockets would be very beneficial. And you are already being attacked and unlawfully attacked. And the Russians are already killing everybody. So for you, it's a huge improvement and a step in the right direction. From our perspective, getting involved directly in the war and having a confrontation between NATO or NATO members and Russia is probably something that changes the equation and is not a desirable outcome, because that would then be a full-fledged war between NATO and Russia. And then that would also give Putin the excuse to do stuff.
So speaking of which, we've gotten far, and it's my fault, from this moment of Chancellor Scholz in Beijing in November 2022. You mentioned it briefly. I said we get back to it, and I want to, because for a podcast about diplomacy, I think it's a really key moment to dissect. So the Chancellor goes to Beijing, initially planned, from what I understand, really as a kind of business forward trip. He brings all of these business executives, plans to sign all these deals. He has, I think, 11 hours on the ground. You can correct me. And in those 11 hours, it's November 2022, he has to, or certainly wants to, get Xi Jinping on board to agree to persuade, convince, pressure, you're going to tell me in a moment, Putin not to use nuclear weapons. In advance of that trip, how does the Chancellor think about formulating his pitch? It's a packed agenda, but this clearly is suddenly at the top of the list of priorities. So what's the strategy going into that meeting, and how, in practice, did he execute, apparently successfully, this message? Because we see coming out of the meeting, Xi announces that he has spoken to Putin or issued some kind of warning not to use nuclear weapons. So this diplomatic gambit comes off. Give us the story behind it.
Yeah, maybe to setting the scene, Germany is still G7 presidency. We are about to have a G20 meeting in Bali later that month in November. That was the first meeting that the Chinese president would have with any Western leader, because they were still in lockdown due to the COVID measures. So when we saw this nuclear escalatory talks, and now it was disclosed that the U.S. administration considered there to be a 50% of chance of use of nukes, this idea that we have like kind of swing states, I think that was a phrase coined by Boris Johnson at the G7 summit in end of June 2022 in Elmau in Bavaria. It became pretty clear that we needed like the China, the Saudi Arabia, the Brazil, the South Africa to be on our side and to pressure Russia. And this nuclear threats probably were one of the elements we could use to bring them on our side. And so, like, how do you do it technically? The National Security Advisor, his team reach out in the preparation of such a trip to the Chinese side, and you say, look, this is what we need, and this is what we think we should talk about. And then you receive signals that this is plausible in what way soever. And then this trip happened. Actually, we brought, I think, the smallest business delegation ever to China, because it was clear it should not be the predominant thing, because there were more important things to deal with. And then the two of them and the delegation discussed all the issues and had this, I mean, basically saying, look, you Chinese, you always said like territorial sovereignty, sovereignty itself, adherence to the UN Charter. These are like harmonious relations between the people. These are the core elements of Chinese foreign policy. Now let's apply that to Russia's actions. They're violating each of your principles. And now they're even threatening with the use of a nuclear bomb. And that what will then lead to not only the statement by the Chinese saying this is kind of a red line, they should not do that, but it also led to later on the Bali Declaration of the G20, which was 19 against 1. And Lavrov, because Putin didn't go, Lavrov, as the foreign secretary of Russia, had a very difficult position in Bali, arguing against 19. And I think that was like a huge success diplomatically to partner up everybody. And in a way, this threat with nuclear was like uniting the rest of the world, saying, you cannot play around with this.
But at the moment in that November trip, what came out of it was really a communique, first and foremost, about the impermissibility of the use of nuclear weapons.
Yes.
At least what the Chinese focused on. They didn't really talk about territorial sovereignty or so on in their communications. So what was the argument? What do you think Scholz was able to say? How did he get Xi on that point specifically? What was it that was most convincing or persuasive, do you think?
The consequences of the use of nuclear arms and probably an assessment of the Chinese that Russia was escalating in a way that would also not be beneficial for their interest. I mean, they want to do business with Europe, and a nuked Europe is probably not a good place and would destroy your foreign investment as well, to put it in economic terms.
Another diplomatic moment I want to unpack with you, and this one I should say up front to you and listeners, is very personal because Evan Gershkovich, American journalist who was arrested in Russia and held in the Fortvo prison for a year and a half, is a very dear friend and colleague, so it was a story I followed with great personal interest. The prisoner exchange happens. Thankfully, Evan and more than a dozen other political prisoners from Russia are freed in August 2024. Very complicated, months-long multilateral negotiations. The US, Germany, Poland, Slovenia, Norway. But really it's the US and from my understanding, Germany that plays a key role in getting these prisoners out of Russia. And that is because Germany held Putin's biggest prize, this hitman killer, Vadim Krasikov, who killed a former Chechen separatist in Tiergarten in the middle of the day, middle of Berlin in 2019. A hitman who seems to have, or I think it's essentially proven at this point, connections to the FSB and the Russian state, was certainly welcomed when he returned to Russia as a hero by Putin. Initially, Germany was very reluctant to give up Krasikov for reasons that are understandable. Here's someone who killed someone in the center of Berlin, sentenced to a life sentence. But eventually, Germany did and played the key role in making this exchange happen. So just walk us through how it took place, how Germany changed its mind, how perhaps you changed your mind, the Chancellor, and Germany ended up playing this key role in this quite historic prisoner exchange.
Yeah. So my problem here is we had, and as always have in Germany, a coalition government. And in coalition governments, out of 3 different parties, you have different actors and different opinions. And like even now, it's been 2 years nearly, I would not like to kind of disclose the internal debates that we had, because I think it is important that governments and coalitions can have differences, and that they're not the side that kind of one would walk out and say...
Without naming names per se, give us an encapsulation of the argument against freeing Krasikov.
You alluded to it basically, and that is, don't negotiate with terrorists. And if you free Krasikov in exchange for a bunch of, including Evan, who's a great guy, and I've got to know him now very well because he lives now in Berlin, and like some human rights activists and others, and including some Germans. So what if, okay, you free them, rightly so, and give away the one person Putin really wants, a killer, a murderer, and then he would send the next killer and murderer to do the next job, and then would again collect random journalists or tourists and to hold them hostage to get the next killer out.
So in abstract, that's convincing. In theory, right? So that sounds convincing. So how did you transcend that argument?
Yeah, exactly. But this is very often happening in politics, that you have to decide between 50% and 50%. So, and both arguments that are made are very compelling themselves.
So walk us through how the government ultimately came to the conclusion that
the end,
it would free Krasikov.
It's a very personal assessment that due to kind of general considerations, you should not have so many people suffering. And for us, as you know, and the Chancellor was pretty clear from the very beginning, for us it was important that we would not only get kind of Westerners out, but we wanted Navalny out, and we wanted some other prominent dissidents or human rights activists.
And how much, not only of a terrible tragedy was it for Navalny, his family, the hopes of so many Russians who potentially saw their political future connected to Navalny in some way, that he's killed in a prison above the Arctic Circle, but how complicating, potentially disastrously so, was it for the idea of an exchange? Because from what I understand, Germany very much wanted him included in a potential prisoner exchange.
And obviously it was a setback because then you added to the argument you should not reward a guy that just had the most prominent dissident or hope for the future of a free Russia being killed in a Russian prison. And you should not reward the system or the guy responsible for doing that.
But yet again, ultimately, Germany came around to the idea that it was worth doing.
It was worth doing because there were others, probably less prominent than Alexei Navalny. And I think the package was right. We always said, look, we need to expand it. Let's make it about more people. And you have to give huge credit to Bill Burns, the CIA, the whole Biden administration, how they pulled that off to bring really from, and you mentioned the countries where you had Russian agents imprisoned, some pre-trial, some already convicted, and to bring that all together and then to make this huge exchange possible. That is one of the things I'm pretty proud of, that we did that and we pulled that off, because I think it was ultimately the right thing to do.
So the end of your time in the Chancellor's office coincides with the re-election of Donald Trump. Tell us a bit about your assessments of him as an American president, your interactions with him or his team, the Chancellor's interactions in this short window with Trump, and sort of what you understood Trump to mean in the context of what we're talking about here. Diplomacy, politics. I mean, we've seen all the kind of big effects, the way he's remaking the transatlantic relationship. But give us this kind of insider look into what it felt like, what the conversations was like, what the assessments were like inside the Chancellor's office in winter 2024 into 25.
So first of all, the Chancellor knew Trump because he was before that the Vice Chancellor and the Finance Minister, and Finance Ministers do travel together with the Chancellor to G20 meetings. And so he had met Trump, and also as a mayor of Hamburg hosting the G20 summit in 2017, I think it was. Trump was coming, and so he was receiving him and obviously exchanging some words and so on and so forth. And we had a little bit of like the experience of the first Trump administration, and I think the most important thing is with Trump, unpredictability. And so it's also difficult to kind of prepare for something that is mainly the main character is unpredictability. What you do then, and Scholz did that as well, reach out to the newly elected president, congratulate him, and try to set up a first call. So Scholz did 2 calls with President-elect Trump before the 20th of January. And what I surprised me, I don't want to go into details because, again, no, I think it's good that politicians have these kind of behind-the-doors conversations. But what struck me, and that goes a bit against the public perception of Trump, he was actually asking a lot of questions about Ukraine, about Putin, about Scholz's assessment of the situation. So wanted to get up to speed and get a feeling, I think, and other European leaders told us that he was doing the same with them to really get a picture, I think, what to expect.
A year later, he seems to be rather out of listening mode. Perhaps that was a short-lived window.
Yeah, I think again, that is how he is, and when you talk about administration, because we had some overlapping time with the new administration. What struck me here at the Munich Security Conference last year, when many of the people were just really recently appointed. I had at a lunch, I was sitting with Tulsi Gabbard, and the director, the newly appointed, I think a day before confirmed, so director of the CIA, and others that were like more the negotiators, like and the national security advisor. What you find there, and you obviously try to establish a personal connection, and then you talk about the issues. And at the very beginning, I think the problem really was that there's one guy that decides, and that is Trump. And all the people around him were still trying to figure out where their position and that new solar system would be, and what Trump actually would want to do. And in my opinion, part of the J.D. Vance's speech was exactly about that. He didn't want to say anything about Middle East. He didn't want to say anything substantial about Ukraine because the president hadn't spoken about that. And so he couldn't publicly say something about it because he had to leave it to the president. And so he was like diverting to cultural issues and all these things about allegedly the suppression of free speech in Europe or in Germany. So it's how I read it.
We started by talking about Germany as this kind of reluctant European power, but one that grew to kind of embrace its voice, its influence. And just to close, talk a bit about, on a personal level, what you think that, again, has meant for you or really people in your role now in the Chancellor's office, now doing diplomacy, security policy for Germany. What's the kind of right calibration, do you think, at this moment in time for a Germany that is fully kind of aware and acknowledges its role and its powers and is not shy about them, yet also isn't kind of reverting to a position that would be kind of overly dominant or muscular and turn off or frighten its allies? Describe your own kind of personal articulation of how that policy and diplomatic posture should look.
Yeah. So obviously at the center is the Franco-German friendship, so a close coordination with the French. And so on the personal level, the person outside of Germany I talked most to was Alexis Colère, the then Secretary General of the Élysée, so my counterpart in the French administration, and then probably Bill Burns as the CIA director. And then you have to expand that. So the idea that only France and Germany can dominate Europe or the European Union is over. And so to expand it both to Poland with the Weimar Triangle, but then also with Italy, with Spain, and then the smaller countries. So to keep Europe together, to make it coherent, and also talk about countries like Hungary. And you might recall, like, one of the arts of diplomacy was when you have this requirement of unanimity in European decisions, especially when it comes to sanctions. And Viktor Orban from Hungary was very reluctant, if not to say opposing stuff. And then Scholz came up with this very brilliant idea to say, look, what if when we have this vote, you're just outside the room having a nice cup of coffee. And wouldn't that be a good idea? And so that is kind of a diplomatic solution where you as Viktor Orban do not have to publicly declare something, but you're just not there. And so like finding out these ways. So that's why I try to keep also the channels open. And then obviously within Europe to have a very close relationship with our British friends. And so, no, I mean, I was more, even though I had my hat as the intelligence coordinator, my predominant role was to keep this coalition together of three parties, as I said, and to concentrate on domestic stuff, because what we are seeing now, the economic problems Germany has, I alluded a little bit to the energy problems, scarcity, price shock, and so on and so forth. But I tried to manage to have to the key players to have a personal relation as well, because at the end, the art of diplomacy is also the art of connecting with people.
Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciated this conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You have been listening to The Art of Diplomacy, a podcast of the Munich Security Conference, produced by Studio Bummens. The show is hosted by Florence Skalp and Joshua Yaffa, with original music by Jakob Ilya. The Munich Security Conference production team includes Andreas Block, Marit Zeisler, Judith Sorden, Noor Saad, and Annalena Enold. For more on this year's Munich Security Conference and for footnotes and references for this episode, please consider our show notes. Most of the conversations in this podcast were recorded at Bayerischer Hof at the Munich Security Conference in mid-February 2026. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show and leave a review. That's it for today. Thanks for listening.